Robin Everett from Gondrand, UK, part of the French company Gondrand. In France, they pronounce it Gondrand, if there's any interest. And we've got a short presentation today about importing, exporting, and the relative pitfalls and the customs procedures which you can follow in acquiring those. So it's all a big jigsaw puzzle, really. And here is something from the import perspective, which is why import in the first place. Basically because it's cheaper than sourcing product from the UK. Essentially, you've then got to find a supplier, negotiate the contract, control the quality, arrange the consolidation and shipment of the consignment, and then deal with HM revenue and customs, who are a bit like going to the dentist. If you follow the procedure and the routines at the beginning, you'll have less visits. So there's the jigsaw puzzle again. Why import? So it's a question of having a new product, the right product, lower price, and speed to market, which in the obvious example of the Far East these days is a very low cost area, but it is increasing. And there has been a migration of manufacturing over the past 30 years, heading ever further east, having gone from the traditional markets, as my colleague from the UKTI was alluding to earlier, being France and Italy, and having gone further east into places such as Turkey, Romania, etc., and even further east into the Far East. And where Asian economies have taken advantage of the available cheap labour pools. That competitive advantage is slowly becoming reduced, where the labour is a large part of the unit cost. I was in China a few years ago and spoke to a chap who was working in a factory there and said, you know, do the people here realise what the products here being made for $2 or $3 are being sold for in Europe and North America? And he said, yes, they're starting to realise, and they're starting to become a middle class. So I think that's what that plate is referring to. So you have to select a supplier, and what primary motivations are you going to use in doing that? Obviously, you have to have a research and a site visit, select the country, bearing in mind the lead time which will be added the further east you go. So the transit time, for example, from China these days by sea is something like 20 to 30 days. By air, obviously, it's a lot less, but a lot more expensive. Whereas, let's say, places like Turkey, you can have the goods in a week. But the net cost of the actual garment is slightly more expensive than, let's say, in China. And you also have to bear in mind the language and culture of the area that you're dealing with. It's always best, although most people do speak English, these days probably because of the Americans rather than us, but never mind. So those are some of the areas and the commodities which at the moment are being imported. Just to say a word about export, obviously this also applies from the other end. So you can imagine yourself, if you're as a supplier, to what is happening in here on the import side. So the trends currently are that factory prices will tend to increase in the short to medium term. The trend seems to be that China will remain dominant and probably shift inland to lower cost bases because the property and labour costs are increasing at on the coastal side of the Chinese areas. You have to look at the customs side as well, and there could be possible anti-dumping tariffs in the future. As well as there's increased sophistication of logistics and IT. And the renminbi will slowly appreciate, it is believed. These days, it's popular for manufacturers to go to other areas outside China, such as Vietnam, Pakistan, Bangladesh. They're all popular areas these days. Ultimately, the untapped markets will be open. Negotiation. Always a difficult item. One thing to bear in mind is terms of trade. As the UKTI chap was alluding to earlier, if you're dealing in America, you must quote in certain areas in landed, as that's all they want to hear about. Whereas some people want to control the flow of their own merchandise and have things quoted on an FOB or ex-works basis, terms I'm sure you're all familiar with. The price you pay. So the price you pay when you look at a product, of course, is the price at the factory. And you then have to add on the cost of moving the product, potential duties on the product if it's coming from outside the EU, and the shipping cost to the cost of that product. So what may start as £4 for an item could in the end become £6 or £7 for an item. And you have to be careful on the costings with that. And there's the question. Who pays for the shipping and insurance, and from where to where? So it also says there, I mean, I'm sure everyone knows what opaque means. I don't know why they put that in there. So you have to bear in mind the risk and the cost and the control that you may have over the movement of the goods. Control being the main aspect of things. So here you can see a diagram showing the seller, the first carrier, the loading port, the destination port, and the frontier where you're likely to encounter the customs. Although it's worth remembering that customs at the end of the day are there to help you, not hinder you. So the terms that you might encounter which you'll probably know if you're dealing in international trade. If you're exporting to your buyer at the other side on a CIF basis, you're liable to pay the transport and the insurance. The other term is CFR, which can either be to the depot of the export end of the consolidation or to the depot at the receiving end of the consolidation, as you can see in the diagram here. Or DDU or DDP. So some customers may want to receive the goods completely free of charge, in which case it will be DDP, so it's delivered, duty paid. And at that point, it's as well to confer with your agent to check the potential duties that could be. They're unlikely to have that here because the duty rates are not the same in the foreign destination countries as they are here. So you may well find that if you confer with your local HMRC office, they may say, well, the duty rate for bringing that in is 7%, but if it's going into China or Brazil or Russia or Turkey, it can be an entirely different rate. One thing which typically happens, particularly with Russian shipments, if you're thinking of exporting there, is that the documents are changed, usually in some third transit country, like Lithuania or an area like that. And there, the receiver will have instructed his agent at the border the actual customs tariff to utilize before the goods go in to be delivered in Russia. There you can see the CIF term. Obviously, if you're buying products for importing, if you're buying on a CIF basis, then your supplier has paid the duty on has paid the freight charge and the insurance charge on the shipment from the other side. FOB, the supplier has paid up to the sending port. Method of payment is another aspect to the trade. And in contract negotiation, of course, you have the least secure and the most secure. The most secure is unlikely to earn you orders from big organizations in the receiving countries, whereas the least secure is likely to receive you orders that you probably don't want. And you can also come into the question of letters of credit and documentary collections, which it's as well if you're dealing on a first-time basis with a customer on the other side to try and have some form of credit in place, or at least, as the UKTI people were alluding to have a credit check done. And there are agencies these days which have worldwide connections. Legal systems, well, I'm no expert in that, I'm afraid. Quality control and production, obviously if you're selling, then you have to have your own QC in place. So you have to mitigate the risk of it. And basically being in touch with your client in either direction is the main thing. So a lot of importers have a presence on the ground these days, and people who are locals will obviously remove the language and cultural barriers. It's important to review and assess vendors if you're importing, and liaise with your customer if you're exporting to them. There's normally a pre-production sample review, which you can normally send by courier or what have you. And then there's quality control during manufacture, which can be in line by post, packed into container. Also, it's a good idea to visit the factories that you're importing from just to have a check. And there are technical testing houses available for lab tests. If the goods are rejected, pass the liability to the factory at site and not in the UK. So to consolidation and shipment, which is where companies like ours come in. You can either dispatch or receive goods as a full load, as a consolidated full load, where it may have been collected from several suppliers or several places in the UK and dispatched to a single point in Europe or beyond, or a groupage service where the consolidator will put the goods together in a vehicle for movement to the other side. Then you have the shipping aspect of the vessel going from point to point, and the unloading in the receiving point. And vessels these days are enormous. So, for example, that one there, I think, can hold something like 5,000 containers. And there are now vessels which are even larger and can hold something between 6,000 and 7,000 containers, mostly for the Far East route. Obviously, when you're going into America and South America, the vessels are usually what's called Panamax for transiting through the Panama Canal, and they're much smaller than the vessels that you see located there, just as a matter of interest. And of course, goods will be loaded and unloaded from professional warehouses. It's important also to keep updated with the current situation as far as port congestion, airline congestion. Airlines tend to become congested, especially towards the end of the year, towards the Christmas period, particularly from the Far East. And they, for that, then start charging premiums for guaranteed services. There you can see the cargo aircraft. As you can see, we're not being particularly partisan in our presentation. And it's also worth keeping in touch with the necessary organisations, although normally your forwarder should do that for you. There you see the options available throughout the world on air and sea services. Of course, within Europe, there are also road services. So be aware of congestion, look at the transport mode, and manage the POs as they're going through, effectively. So step by step, you have the vendor management, the trucking to the CFS or port of export if it's a complete load, HM customs and revenue clearance, either at destination if you're exporting or here if you're importing, and trucking to the final destination, normally a DC if it's a large multinational corporation that you're delivering to. And so to revenue and customs, which was the finally I've got round to the subject of the presentation, which is customs and taxes. In fact, customs is applicable even if you're exporting within the European Union. Because although you don't have to actually make an individual customs declaration as you do outside the European Union, you still have to present what's called an intrastat declaration to customs, which is part of your VAT return. So as you know, you can reclaim the VAT anyway, which becomes the balance of the output and the input of VAT, but you still have to declare goods separately that you're sending to the European Union, which you can either do yourself on your VAT return, or you can have an agent carry that work out for you. Obviously, if you're exporting outside the European Union, then the customs requirement is for an electronic connection usually. It's quite complicated if you want to go and do a hard copy. You'd actually have to go to your local HMRC office with the documents and register them. Most forwarders, or what we would call integrators, let's say courier companies like UPS, DHL, have an electronic connection to customs where they make the declaration on your behalf. And if you negotiate hard enough, you can probably get it within the cost of your movement. So title documents are quite important. They're different in terms of the mode of transport that you would use throughout the world. Normally, for aircraft carriage, you have an airway bill, which is the document of title. For sea shipment, you would have a bill of lading. And for road shipments, you would have a way bill or CMR, which is also the insurance document for the movement going from point to point. And it's important to have those documents correctly completed, particularly if you're involved with a letter of credit. Because the letter of credit may call for the documents in a certain form or a certain wording, and you must follow the instructions on the letter of credit if you want the bank to pay you your money at the end of the day. Taxes vary worldwide. Obviously, there's no tax involved except, as I was alluding to earlier, with the intrastats for the European Union, but outside the European Union, you will have to account for taxes being payable on the products that you're sending. In some areas, there are agreements which either reduce or nullify the taxes payable. For example, GSP in the case of China, ATR in the case of Turkey, EUR in the case of Switzerland, places like Switzerland, and that also applies in Israel. So it's worth checking before you're selling to your customer, just to advise them, yes, we know that in your case in Israel is an EUR1. So that's referring there to GSP and licensing. Licensing is another aspect, very important if you're dealing with, let's say, emerging markets, and particularly places like, let's say, Iran. It's best to check with the UKTI there because you can be subject to an export license for items. Even once the embargo is lifted, there could still be licensing for certain products in those kinds of areas. Yeah, VAT is recoverable and duty is not. So if you're importing from a non-EU area, you could be liable for duty which you cannot then recover, whereas VAT is recovered through your VAT return, which becomes the balance of your input and your output. There are two types of duty. There is specific duty, which is applicable to things such as, let's say, hydrocarbon fuels, alcohols, those kind of things, which is a specific amount, either per litre or per kilo or per whatever unit it's calculated in. Whereas the other duty is ad valorem, so based on the value of the product. So if the duty rate, for example, is 7% and you're bringing in something worth £100, your duty will be £7. Having a customs deferment, if you're importing on a very regular basis, can be useful, or you can ask your agent to utilise that. Most agents have their own deferment, but they will charge for the use of that, usually on a percentage of the value of the VAT. There are 14,000 classification codes, in case it's of any interest to anybody. It's not to me. You have to be careful of quotas, suspension, and levies. Quotas are often put on goods which are coming to the UK and flooding the UK market. So the customs may then say, okay, well, we can only allow another 100,000 pieces of whatever it might be, silk scarves or whatever. Regimes usually refers to drawback regimes. So if, for example, you're importing fabric from one country and then exporting the product to a third country, you can claim what's called a drawback on the duty that would be payable on the fabric coming in. My colleague Wayne at the back there can explain more about that for you later. So getting it right. Import for the right reasons, make sure it's the right strategy and it's financially viable, select the right people, which is as valid going in the other direction to select the customer that you're dealing with on the other side, negotiate the best deal, goes without saying really, safeguard the quality, whether you're importing the product or sending it out, manage the supply chain, and minimize the tax impact on cash flow with items such as I was talking about of the drawback potential. Identify that importing is the correct strategy. Use the puzzle to take control and avoid risk. Engage the right suppliers to manage your supply chain. And complete the puzzle. And it can apply to exporting as well.